In the autumn of 1883, when the Louisiana bayous exhaled their last breath of summer heat, something unnatural burned in Cypress Knee Bayou. The flames that consumed the LaRue compound flickered blue and green, fed by heart pine resin and kerosene, casting shadows that danced like demons across the black water. Witnesses claimed they heard a woman's scream pierce the night air, not of agony, but of triumph, before it was swallowed by the roar of consuming fire. What remained by dawn was ash and bone, the skeletal remains of 11 souls, and a single piece of evidence that would haunt investigators for decades. A charred shipping manifest, barely legible, bore a handwritten note in the margin: "Final justice delivered by the captive bride." The coroner's report would later describe the scene as ritualistic, the bodies arranged as if in ceremony, but it was an anonymous letter sent to the New Orleans Picayune that spoke the truth no official document dared record. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. The bayou keeps its secrets buried deep, but sometimes those secrets claw their way to the surface, demanding to be heard. This was not mere arson or family dispute gone wrong. This was the final act of a woman who discovered that her wedding night would also be her funeral, and who chose to turn the altar into a pyre. But who was this bride, and what drove her to become the architect of an entire family's end? Cypress Knee Bayou sprawled across the southeastern corner of Vermilion Parish. Like a cancer, its twisted waterways defying every attempt at proper mapping. The Spanish moss hung so thick from ancient cypress trees that noon looked like dusk, and the water ran black as ink, stained by centuries of rotting vegetation and secrets. This was not the romantic Louisiana of plantation tours and jazz funerals. This was the Louisiana that swallowed men whole and never gave back their bones. The LaRue compound sat on what locals called Devil's Island, a patch of semi-solid ground accessible only by pirogue through a maze of channels that shifted with every flood and drought. Even the most experienced trappers spoke of getting lost in the bayou's embrace, of following familiar waterways only to find themselves deeper in the maze than when they started. The cypress roots reached up from the water like gnarled fingers, and more than one man had sworn he heard whispers in the wind that moved through those branches. Old Man Bastian, who had worked these waters for 40 years, would later tell the coroner that navigating to the LaRue Island required not just knowledge of the channels, but permission from the bayou itself. The water would either carry you to your destination or lead you in circles until darkness fell and the real dangers emerged from the deep. He spoke of seeing lights that had no source, hearing voices that belonged to no living throat, and feeling watched by eyes that reflected the moon like an animal's. The distance from Port Sanguine to Devil's Island measured less than 5 miles as the crow flies, but the psychological barrier stretched far wider. The town existed in the world of commerce and civilization, while the bayou belonged to something older, something that remembered when these waters covered everything, and man was just another creature struggling to survive. Between these two worlds, the LaRue family had built their kingdom of isolation and blood. The geography itself seemed to conspire with the family's desire for secrecy. Dense fog rolled off the water most mornings, creating a natural screen that obscured movement between the islands. The channels twisted and branched in patterns that confused even experienced boatmen, and the tides brought debris that could block passages for weeks at a time. During the summer months, when the water levels dropped, new obstacles emerged from the depths, forcing travelers to find alternative routes that might not exist when they attempted to return. In this place that defied maps, a family built a kingdom of silence and blood. The LaRue bloodline traced back to French-Canadian trappers who had drifted south in the late 1700s. following the fur trade and fleeing debts that could not be paid. They were hardy stock, accustomed to isolation and suspicious of authority. But somewhere in their exile to the Louisiana swamps, something had gone terribly wrong with their family tree. What the locals called the sorning had taken hold of their bloodline, twisting bone and corrupting mind with each generation of intermarriage. Silas LaRue, the clan patriarch in 1883, stood nearly 7 feet tall but walked with a pronounced limp that made his gait resemble that of a wounded bear. His left eye had clouded white with cataracts, while the right burned with an intensity that made grown men look away. His hands, massive and scarred from decades of trapping and worse pursuits, bore 6 fingers each, the extra digits fully formed and functional. When he spoke, his voice carried the thick patois of backwater French, mixed with English, creating a dialect that sounded more animal than human to civilized ears. The physical deformities that marked the LaRue bloodline extended beyond mere appearance into realms of genuine disability and suffering. Silas's limp resulted from a twisted spine that had never properly formed, causing him constant pain that he managed with a combination of moonshine and herbs that grew wild in the deepest parts of the swamp. His enlarged skull housed a brain that functioned with the calculating cruelty of a predator, but his thinking patterns showed signs of the mental deterioration that plagued his entire family line. Matilda LaRue, known to all as Ma Tildy, served as the clan's spiritual leader and keeper of their twisted traditions. Blind in her left eye from a childhood accident involving lye soap, she claimed her remaining sight could peer into the spirit world and commune with the ancestors who demanded blood purity above all else. Her face bore the distinctive LaRue features, the pronounced brow ridge and narrow jaw that marked the family like a brand, but her mind remained sharp despite the physical deterioration that plagued her bloodline. The old woman's hands showed the distinctive webbing between fingers that marked several members of the family, a genetic quirk that had proven useful for swimming in the bayou's treacherous waters, but served as a visible reminder of their isolation from normal human development. Her teeth had grown in patterns that made proper speech difficult, forcing her to communicate in a mixture of French patois, hand gestures, and guttural sounds that others found disturbing. Ephraim, Silas's eldest son and heir to the family's dark legacy, possessed a hunchback that forced him to walk bent forward, his arms nearly reaching the ground. Despite his physical limitations, he moved through the bayou with supernatural grace, his twisted form perfectly adapted to navigating the narrow channels and treacherous root systems that protected the family compound. His eyes held the same burning intensity as his father's, but where Silas showed calculated cruelty, Ephraim displayed the unpredictable rage of a cornered animal. The younger generation of LaRue children showed even more severe manifestations of their genetic corruption. Several had been born with club feet that required special boots crafted from alligator hide, while others displayed mental deficiencies that rendered them capable of only the simplest tasks. The family's isolation had protected them from outside scrutiny, but it had also accelerated their genetic decline to the point where each new birth carried the risk of producing offspring too damaged to survive. The family's reputation in Port Sanguine existed in whispered conversations and knowing glances. They provided rare goods, heart pine timber from trees that had grown for centuries, exotic pelts from animals that should not exist in Louisiana waters, and mysterious compounds that the town's doctor purchased without asking questions about their origin. In return, the townspeople maintained a careful silence about the LaRue family's business, understanding that some transactions required willful blindness to preserve the delicate balance between civilization and the wild. But a family tree this twisted cannot grow forever without breaking, and the LaRues knew they needed new life, whatever the cost. 10 years before Alara Dubois would burn their world to ash, the Leroux family had provided Port Sanguin with its first clear warning of their true nature. A trapper named Michel Boudreau, a man known for his honesty and his skill with both rifle and pirogue, had ventured into Cypress Knee Bayou to collect a debt from Silas Leroux. The patriarch owed him for winter supplies, flour and coffee and ammunition that had been delivered on credit, and Boudreau's own family needed the money to survive the coming season. Boudreau's wife Marie had begged him not to go, crossing herself and muttering prayers in French as she watched her husband load his skiff with supplies for the journey. The children clung to his legs, sensing their mother's fear even if they could not understand its source. But debt was debt, and a man's word meant everything in a world where trust could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Michel Boudreau kissed his family goodbye on a Tuesday morning and poled his way into the green maze of the bayou. The journey to Devil's Island normally required most of a day, following channels that wound through stands of ancient cypress and over underwater obstacles that could trap an unwary boat. Boudreau had made the trip before, delivering supplies to the Leroux compound during their rare ventures into legitimate commerce, and he knew the landmarks that marked the safe passages through the treacherous waterways. His wife packed enough food for 3 days, allowing time for the collection of the debt and the careful navigation required to return safely to Port Sanguin. 3 days later, his empty skiff drifted back to the Port Sanguin docks, filled with a strange black moss that none of the local fishermen had ever seen before. The moss gave off a sweet, cloying smell that reminded witnesses of flowers left too long in a funeral parlor, and when they tried to remove it from the boat, it crumbled to dust at their touch. Boudreau's rifle remained in the boat, but his ammunition pouch had been emptied and strange scratches covered the wooden sides of the skiff, as if something with claws had tried to climb inside. The most disturbing detail emerged during the examination of Boudreau's possessions. His money pouch, which should have contained the payment he sought from Silas Leroux, was missing entirely, but his personal effects showed signs of careful arrangement rather than random scattering. Someone had gone through his belongings with methodical precision, removing specific items while leaving others untouched. His compass remained, but his maps had been taken. His knife was still in its sheath, but his flint and steel had vanished. Sheriff John Crocker mounted what he called an investigation, but his search consisted of a single trip to the edge of the bayou with 2 reluctant deputies. They stood on the wooden dock that marked the boundary between the civilized world and the green hell beyond, calling Boudreau's name across the water and waiting for an echo that never came. From somewhere deep in the maze of channels, a single gunshot answered their calls, the sound rolling across the water like thunder before fading into the oppressive silence of the swamp. The sound of that gunshot would haunt the memory of everyone who heard it, not because of its volume or timing, but because of what it implied about Boudreau's fate. The report suggested a large-caliber weapon fired at close range, the kind of shot that would end a man's suffering quickly and efficiently. Whether that shot represented mercy or murder remained a question that the official investigation chose not to pursue. The official report listed Michel Boudreau as missing, presumed drowned, but everyone in Port Sanguin understood the real message. The bayou had claimed another soul, and asking too many questions about the circumstances would only invite the same fate. The Leroux family's debt disappeared from the ledger books, and Marie Boudreau never spoke her husband's name again, understanding that some forms of justice existed beyond the reach of civilized law. This was the unspoken agreement: stay out of the bayou, and the bayou's monsters won't come to town. Alara Dubois arrived in Port Sanguin on the morning paddle wheeler from New Orleans, carrying everything she owned in a single leather valise and a portfolio of botanical sketches that revealed both artistic talent and scientific precision. At 24, she possessed the kind of classical beauty that belonged in parlor portraits, with dark hair that caught the light like silk and eyes the color of deep water. But her beauty carried an edge of intelligence that made men uncomfortable and women jealous, the look of someone who asked too many questions and remembered all the answers. The orphaned daughter of a Creole scholar who had died, leaving nothing but books and debt, Alara had educated herself through necessity and force of will. She spoke 4 languages, understood the principles of chemistry and botany, and possessed a natural talent for reading people's intentions in their expressions and gestures. These skills had served her well as a private tutor for wealthy families in New Orleans, but scandal had followed her when she refused the advances of a prominent businessman and made her refusal public knowledge. The businessman in question, a cotton factor named Augusta Trem, had assumed that Alara's financial desperation would make her amenable to an arrangement that involved considerably more than tutoring his children. When she rebuffed his advances with the kind of public humiliation that damaged his reputation among his peers, he had used his considerable influence to ensure that no respectable family in New Orleans would employ her services. The whisper campaign that followed painted her as a woman of questionable morals who had seduced her employer and then blackmailed him when he rejected her advances. The position in Port Sanguine came through a carefully worded advertisement in the New Orleans Picayune, seeking a refined lady of good education to tutor the children of the Thibodeau family in French literature and natural philosophy. The salary offered exceeded anything she could expect in the city, and the isolation of rural Louisiana appealed to her desire to escape the whispers and knowing glances that had made her life in New Orleans unbearable. She saw the opportunity as a chance to rebuild her reputation and pursue her passion for documenting the unique flora of the Louisiana wetlands. Her first weeks in Port Sanguine passed peacefully enough. The Thibodeau children proved eager students, and Alara found herself fascinated by the exotic plant life that flourished in the humid climate. She spent her free afternoons sketching rare orchids and cataloging medicinal herbs, building a collection that she hoped might someday earn publication in a scientific journal. Her landlady, a widow named Celeste Broussard, warned her about venturing too close to the bayou alone, but Alara dismissed such cautions as rural superstition. The warnings she received from the townspeople carried an undercurrent of genuine fear that she initially attributed to the natural anxiety that isolated communities felt about their wild surroundings. But as the weeks passed, she began to notice patterns in their conversations that suggested specific rather than general concerns. They spoke of the LaRue family in the same hushed tones that children used when telling ghost stories, and their warnings about the bayou always included references to people who had ventured too deep and never returned. On the morning of August 10th, 1883, Alara walked to her favorite sketching spot on the wooden pier that extended into the dark water at the edge of town. She had discovered a rare variety of spider lily growing wild among the cypress roots, its white petals tinged with purple in a pattern she had never seen documented. Her sketch was half finished when the sounds of the swamp fell suddenly silent, that unnatural quiet that comes when predators move through the wilderness. She looked up from her work to find Ephraim Leroux standing at the other end of the pier, his twisted form silhouetted against the morning sun. His presence radiated a menace that made her skin crawl, but before she could speak or run, rough hands seized her from behind, and a burlap sack came down over her head, blocking out the world in scratchy darkness. The last thing she remembered was the smell of unwashed bodies and rotting vegetation, and the sensation of being lifted into a boat that rocked under multiple sets of feet. Alara didn't wander into the swamp. She was harvested by it. The room where they held Alara measured perhaps 10 feet square, with walls of weathered cypress planks and a single window covered by rusted iron bars. The floor consisted of rough-hewn boards that creaked under her weight, and Spanish moss had been stuffed between the wall joints to keep out the worst of the mosquitoes. A wooden bucket served as her chamber pot, and her meals arrived twice daily on a dented tin plate, usually consisting of rice and beans, with occasional scraps of meat she chose not to examine too closely. But this was not the brutal captivity of common criminals. Her captors treated her with a terrifying clinical precision, as if she were a valuable specimen that required careful handling to maintain its usefulness. They provided her with soap and clean water for washing, fresh linens for the narrow cot, and even books to occupy her mind during the long hours of confinement. Ma Tildy visited daily, bringing herbal teas that she claimed would purify the blood, and speaking in her strange patois about the sacred duty that Alara would soon fulfill. The books they gave her revealed disturbing insights into the LaRue family's twisted philosophy. Most were religious texts, but not the familiar Christianity of mainstream denominations. These volumes dealt with older forms of worship, practices that predated European settlement and drew from both African spiritual traditions and Native American beliefs about blood sacrifice and communion with ancestral spirits. The margins contained handwritten notes in multiple generations of LaRue handwriting, documenting their family's gradual descent into ritualistic madness. Through careful listening and observation, Alara began to understand the horrific logic behind her imprisonment. The LaRue family suffered from what Ma Tildy called the sourning, a corruption of their bloodline that grew worse with each generation of intermarriage. Physical deformities, mental instability, and early death had reduced their numbers to barely a dozen souls, and they believed that only an infusion of pure blood could save their family from extinction. The wedding dress they brought her had been worn by previous brides, a yellowed silk gown that reeked of lavender and decay. The fabric showed signs of repeated cleaning, but stains remained that spoke of violence and terror. Ma Tildy explained the ritual with religious fervor, describing how Alara's union with Silas would create a new generation of LaRue children untainted by the family curse. But the old woman's eyes held secrets darker than mere forced marriage, and her references to previous brides carried ominous implications about the fate of Alara's predecessors. The preparation rituals that Ma Tildy conducted revealed the depth of the family's delusion about their supernatural situation. She burned herbs that she claimed would attract the ancestors' approval, mixed potions that would enhance Alara's fertility, and conducted ceremonies designed to purify the compound's spiritual atmosphere. But beneath the religious rhetoric lay a more practical concern. The family needed genetic diversity to survive, and they had chosen kidnapping and forced marriage as their solution to the problem of inbreeding. During her third week of captivity, Alara overheard an argument between Silas and Ephraim that revealed the true horror of her situation. The purification rite was not about childbirth, but about sacrifice, the ancient belief that spilling pure blood on cursed ground would appease whatever dark forces had afflicted their family. The ritual dagger passed down through generations of LaRue patriarchs would open her throat during the wedding ceremony, and her blood would water the earth where their ancestors lay buried. The discovery of her true fate transformed Alara's approach to her captivity from passive resistance to active preparation for escape. She began studying the family's routines with scientific precision, noting the times when guards changed, the locations of potential weapons and accelerants, and the layout of the compound's buildings. Her background in chemistry provided knowledge that would prove crucial in the final confrontation, understanding how kerosene and resin could combine to create a conflagration that would consume everything in its path. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear stories that reveal the monsters hiding behind religious ceremony and family tradition. The LaRue clan believed they were preserving their bloodline, but they were actually feeding an addiction to violence that had consumed their humanity generations ago. Trapped in a ritual she never agreed to, Alara understood that her only path to survival was to turn their ceremony into a funeral. Old man Bastien Trosclair had worked the edges of LaRue territory for 20 years, setting his trap lines just close enough to their island to catch the muskrats and nutria that fed in their channels, but never so close as to invite confrontation with the family that claimed dominion over the deeper waters. He was a careful man, the kind who survived decades in the bayou by knowing when to push forward and when to retreat, and his instincts told him that something had changed in the rhythm of life around Devil's Island. The first sign came in late August, when his trap lines closer to the LaRue compound began producing smaller catches. The animals seemed to be avoiding the area, as if some predator or disturbance had altered their normal feeding patterns. Bastien might have dismissed this as seasonal variation, but his grandmother had taught him that the bayou spoke to those who knew how to listen, and the message he heard carried undertones of fear and wrongness. The old trapper possessed knowledge of the bayou that surpassed that of any living man. Understanding gained through decades of patient observation and careful experimentation with the waterways that others found impassable. He knew which channels flowed deep enough for his pirogue during dry seasons, which islands provided safe camping during storms, and which areas harbored dangers that could kill a man before he understood his peril. His intimate knowledge of the ecosystem made the recent changes around Devil's Island particularly disturbing. On September 15th, while checking his northernmost trapline, Bastien saw her through the barred window of what he had always assumed was a storage building. A young woman with dark hair and pale skin, dressed in white but moving with the careful posture of someone who knew she was being watched. Her face turned toward the window for just a moment, and Bastien saw something in her eyes that he would later describe to the coroner as the look of a trapped animal that still remembers being free. The woman's appearance troubled Bastien for reasons he could not articulate. The LaRue women all bore the distinctive features of their corrupted bloodline, the heavy brow and narrow jaw that marked generations of intermarriage. But this woman looked different, refined in a way that suggested education and breeding from outside the swamp. Her movements carried a dignity that seemed foreign to the crude environment of the compound, like a rare bird caged among buzzards. Bastien's subsequent observations revealed a pattern of activity around the compound that differed markedly from the family's normal routines. Additional boats came and went at unusual hours, carrying supplies that appeared to be related to some kind of ceremony or celebration. The smell of burning herbs drifted across the water on certain evenings, and the sound of chanting could be heard when the wind carried sound from the island to his hidden observation post. 2 days later, Bastien witnessed an argument between Silas and Ephraim that carried across the water with enough clarity for him to understand the gist of their disagreement. The elder LaRue spoke of completing the ritual and appeasing the ancestors, while his son expressed concerns about outside attention and taking too many risks. The conversation ended with Silas striking his son across the face hard enough to be heard 50 yards away, and Ephraim's subsequent retreat into the compound's main building. The intensity of the family's preparations suggested that whatever they planned would happen soon, and Bastien's concern for the captive woman grew as he observed the increasing frequency of their ritual activities. The herbs they burned carried scents that reminded him of funeral preparations, and the chanting that echoed across the water contained words in languages that predated European settlement in Louisiana. These elements combined to create a picture of impending violence that the old trapper could not ignore. The old trapper's conscience warred with his survival instincts for 3 weeks before he made his decision. Sheriff Crocker had proven himself untrustworthy in matters involving the LaRue family, but Dr. Alphonse Leroy, the parish coroner, had always struck Bastien as an honest man, despite his peculiar interests in what he called hereditary degeneracy. On October 8th, Bastien poled his pirogue to the Port Sanguin docks and made his way to the coroner's office, where he delivered his testimony in the careful, measured words of a man who understood that speaking truth could carry a fatal price. But the witness's testimony would arrive too late to save the bride. It would only serve to explain her vengeance. Dr. Alphonse Leroy possessed the kind of academic curiosity that made him both an excellent coroner and a dangerous man to those who preferred their secrets buried. His fascination with what he termed hereditary degeneracy had led him to document the physical and mental deterioration of several isolated families throughout southern Louisiana, and Bastien's testimony about a captive woman fit perfectly with his theories about the social pathologies that developed in communities cut off from normal civilization. The coroner's interest in the LaRue family extended beyond mere professional curiosity into the realm of scientific obsession. He had spent years collecting evidence of genetic deterioration in isolated populations, documenting cases where inbreeding had produced physical deformities and mental instabilities that passed from generation to generation. The LaRue clan represented the most extreme example of such deterioration that he had encountered, and the opportunity to study their practices firsthand excited his academic sensibilities. Dr. Leroy's pressure on Sheriff Crocker took the form of thinly veiled threats about official inquiries and state intervention, the kind of bureaucratic warfare that could destroy a small-town politician's career without requiring any actual evidence of wrongdoing. The coroner possessed connections in Baton Rouge and New Orleans that could trigger investigations into local law enforcement practices, and Crocker understood that his comfortable arrangement with the LaRue family depended on maintaining the appearance of proper law enforcement. The sheriff's reluctance to investigate the LaRue compound stemmed from more than mere corruption or cowardice. He had grown up hearing stories about the family's supernatural abilities and their connections to forces that existed beyond normal human understanding. These beliefs, rooted in childhood fears and reinforced by decades of unexplained incidents, created a psychological barrier that rational argument could not easily overcome. Crocker genuinely believed that direct confrontation with the LaRue clan would result in consequences worse than death. On October 12th, Sheriff Crocker assembled a posse consisting of himself, 2 reluctant deputies, and Dr. Leroy as an official observer. The search party made a great show of their departure from Port Sanguin, loading their boats with rifles and camping supplies, as if preparing for an extended expedition into hostile territory. The townspeople gathered on the docks to watch them leave, some offering prayers for their safe return, others placing bets on whether they would find anything worth finding. The reality of their search bore little resemblance to serious law enforcement. Crocker led the party along the most accessible channels of the bayou, avoiding the deeper passages that would have required expert navigation and genuine risk. When they encountered LaRue traplines and boundary markers, the sheriff ordered careful detours that kept them well away from any actual confrontation with the family they supposedly sought to investigate. The expedition's route followed a predictable pattern designed to consume time while minimizing danger. The deputies who accompanied Crocker understood the performative nature of their mission and showed little enthusiasm for venturing deeper into the bayou than their orders required. Both men had families to support and mortgages to pay, making them reluctant to risk their lives investigating crimes that the community preferred to ignore. Their weapons remained unloaded, and their attention focused more on potential escape routes than on evidence of criminal activity. After 6 hours of theatrical exploration, during which they discovered nothing more threatening than a few abandoned muskrat dens, Crocker declared the search complete and ordered the return to Port Sanguine. His official report, filed that evening, concluded that Old Man Bastian had likely witnessed reflections on the water, or Spanish moss moving in the wind, the kind of optical illusions that could deceive even experienced bayou dwellers under certain atmospheric conditions. Dr. Leroy's protests about the inadequacy of their search fell on deaf ears, and the coroner found himself facing subtle but unmistakable pressure to abandon his inquiries into LaRue family activities. The message was clear. Some areas of Vermilion Parish existed beyond the reach of official law, and those who insisted on poking into such matters might find themselves facing the same fate as Michel Boudreau. With the law willingly blind, Alara was left with only one conclusion. She was the only law that could reach the heart of the bayou. The true scope of Port Sanguine's complicity in the LaRue family's crimes would only become clear after the fire, when the destruction of the compound forced a deeper examination of the town's financial records. Sheriff Crocker's personal ledger, discovered during the settlement of his estate after his hasty departure from Vermilion Parish, contained a series of entries that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning nearly a decade of his tenure in office. The payments began appearing in 1875, modest amounts at first, listed under the cryptic designation LR Timber, and occurring with suspicious regularity every 3 months. The amounts grew steadily over time, from an initial $50 to sums that exceeded the sheriff's official salary by considerable margins. Cross-referencing these payments with the town's shipping records revealed a pattern of coincidence that stretched credibility beyond any reasonable doubt. The financial relationship between Crocker and the LaRue family extended beyond simple bribery into a complex web of mutual benefit that involved multiple members of Port Sanguine's business community. The sheriff's ledger contained references to meetings with Mayor Thibodeau, banker Auguste Melançon, and several prominent merchants who had profited from the timber smuggling operation. These men formed an informal consortium that protected the LaRue family's activities in exchange for access to resources that could not be obtained through legal channels. The singed shipping manifest found in the ruins of the LaRue compound provided the missing piece of this financial puzzle. The document detailed shipments of heart of pine timber, the dense, resin-rich wood that grew only in trees of exceptional age and size, to a company owned by the mayor's brother-in-law. The timber commanded premium prices in New Orleans construction markets, where its resistance to decay and insect damage made it invaluable for foundation work and shipbuilding. But the trees described in the shipping manifest should not have existed in commercially viable quantities anywhere in Vermilion Parish. The heart pine forests of Louisiana had been largely depleted by decades of aggressive logging, and the remaining stands existed primarily on protected lands or in areas too remote for profitable harvesting. The LaRue family's access to such valuable timber raised disturbing questions about the source of their inventory and the methods they used to harvest it. Investigation of the company receiving the timber revealed additional layers of corruption. The business existed primarily on paper, with no employees beyond the mayor's relative and no facilities beyond a single warehouse that rarely held inventory for more than a few days before shipping everything to buyers in distant cities. The profits from these transactions never appeared in any local tax records, suggesting a deliberate effort to hide the true scope of the operation from state and federal authorities. The most disturbing entries in Crocker's ledger coincided perfectly with the disappearances that had plagued the region over the previous decade. Michel Boudreau's vanishing corresponded with a payment of $300, while the mysterious absence of a traveling preacher in 1881 matched another significant deposit. The pattern suggested that the sheriff's compensation increased based on his willingness to ignore not just timber smuggling, but far more serious crimes. A deeper examination of the financial records revealed that the timber operation served as a front for other illegal activities that generated even greater profits for the conspirators. The LaRue family's isolation made their compound an ideal location for processing stolen goods, manufacturing illegal substances, and hiding evidence of crimes committed throughout the region. The Heart Pine timber provided legitimate cover for regular shipments that could contain almost anything without attracting official scrutiny. The town council's emergency sessions following the fire focused primarily on damage control rather than justice. Mayor Thibodeau, whose family had employed Ilara as a tutor, publicly expressed sorrow for the tragic accident that had claimed so many lives, but privately worked to suppress any investigation that might reveal the full extent of the community's complicity in the LaRue family's activities. The mayor's connections in state government proved crucial in limiting outside interference in local affairs. The fire didn't just reveal a family's crimes, it exposed a town that had sold its soul for timber. October 30th, 1883, dawned gray and humid, with low clouds that trapped the bayou's exhalations like a lid on a simmering pot. The LaRue compound buzzed with activity as the family prepared for the ceremony that would either save their bloodline or mark its final corruption. Ma Tildy had spent days purifying the chapel with sage and sulfur, while Silas and his sons arranged the altar where their ancestors' bones lay buried beneath the floorboards. The chapel itself represented the culmination of decades of twisted devotion, a structure built specifically to house the family's ritualistic activities. The walls bore carvings that depicted scenes from their private mythology, images of blood sacrifice and communion with ancestral spirits that would have horrified any observer familiar with conventional religious imagery. The altar consisted of a massive cypress stump that had been hollowed out to hold the bones of previous sacrificial victims, their remains serving as a foundation for the ceremonies that sustained the family's supernatural beliefs. Ilara awoke to the sound of hammering as the men boarded up the chapel's windows, ostensibly to keep out evil spirits, but actually to prevent any witness from observing the ritual murder they planned to commit. The wedding dress lay across her cot like a funeral shroud, its yellowed silk emanating the cloying smell of previous brides who had worn it to their deaths. Her breakfast arrived with an extra portion of the bitter tea that Ma Tildy claimed would prepare her spirit for the journey ahead. But Ilara had spent her weeks of captivity in careful observation rather than despair. She had noted the family's routines, the locations of their kerosene stores, the placement of the oil lanterns that provided the compound's only illumination after dark. Her knowledge of chemistry, gained through years of reading her father's books and experimenting with botanical compounds, had shown her that the resin-saturated wood of the buildings would burn with explosive intensity once properly ignited. The preparation of her escape plan required patience and careful timing, as she could only move freely during specific periods when her guards' attention was focused elsewhere. She had identified several containers of kerosene stored in the compound's kitchen, lamp oil that could be easily diverted to create the accelerant trails she needed to ensure rapid combustion. Her understanding of chemical reactions told her that the combination of kerosene, resin, and dry timber would create a conflagration that could consume the entire compound within minutes. The ceremony began at sunset, with the family gathering in the chapel, while Ma Tildy chanted invocations in a mixture of French and what might have been Choctaw, calling upon their ancestors to accept the sacrifice that would purify their corrupted bloodline. Silas stood at the altar wearing a coat that had belonged to his grandfather, its fabric stained with substances that Ilara chose not to contemplate. The ritual dagger, its blade darkened by decades of blood offerings, gleamed in the lantern light like a promise of death. The family's intoxication on moonshine and religious fervor created the perfect opportunity for Alara's plan to unfold. Their attention focused entirely on the ritual proceedings, leaving them oblivious to her careful movements as she positioned herself near the chapel's entrance. The matches she had stolen from the kitchen during her supervised visits to wash dishes remained hidden in her sleeve, waiting for the moment when Ma Tildy's chanting would reach its crescendo and cover the sound of ignition. As the chanting reached its crescendo, Alara made her move. The matches she had stolen from the kitchen during her supervised visits to wash dishes ignited the kerosene trail she had carefully prepared during the afternoon. When the family's attention was focused on their ritual preparations, the fire caught with a whoosh that silenced Ma Tildy's invocations, blue flames racing along the walls with supernatural speed as the dry timber and accumulated resin provided perfect fuel for the conflagration. The chapel became a furnace within minutes, the boarded windows trapping the smoke and heat, while the family clawed desperately at exits that had been sealed to prevent her escape. Silas's bellows of rage turned to screams of agony as his coat caught fire, while Ma Tildy's final prayers were lost in the roar of combustion that consumed everything the LaRue family had built over generations of isolation and crime. The ritual dagger fell from Silas's hand as the flames engulfed him, its blade glowing red-hot before melting into the growing inferno. Alara plunged into the black water of the bayou as the chapel collapsed behind her, the cold embrace of the swamp preferable to the hell she had created for her captors. She swam through channels choked with lily pads and debris, guided by starlight and the desperate need to put distance between herself and the evidence of her terrible justice. Behind her, the compound burned with flames that could be seen for miles, a beacon that announced the end of the LaRue family's reign of terror. The other buildings of the compound caught fire as burning debris from the chapel spread the conflagration throughout the island. The main house, the storage sheds, and even the dock where the family's boats were moored all succumbed to the advancing flames, ensuring that nothing would remain to shelter any survivors who might have escaped the initial blaze. The fire burned through the night, consuming not just the physical structures but the accumulated evidence of decades of criminal activity. By dawn, the LaRues were gone, but the question remained: was the woman who did this a monster or a savior? The truth about the LaRue family's purification rite lay buried in Ma Tildy's ritual notes, documents that survived the fire only because she had hidden copies in a metal strongbox beneath the chapel's floorboards. Dr. Leroy discovered these papers during his official examination of the ruins, and their contents revealed a horror far beyond what anyone had imagined about the family's intentions for their captive bride. The ritual notes, written in Ma Tildy's spidery handwriting and illustrated with disturbing diagrams, detailed ceremonies that traced back to the family's earliest days in the bayou. The documents described encounters with entities that existed in the deep swamp, creatures that demanded regular offerings of human blood in exchange for protection from the hostile forces that claimed so many other isolated communities. The LaRue family's survival through generations of hardship had been purchased through a covenant sealed in sacrifice and maintained through ritualistic murder. The ceremony was never about marriage or childbirth, despite the wedding dress and religious trappings that disguised its true purpose. Ma Tildy's meticulous records detailed a sacrifice ritual that required the death of carefully selected victims, whose blood would appease whatever dark entities had sustained their family through decades of isolation and degeneracy. The pure blood they sought was not meant to produce children, but to feed creatures that existed beyond normal human understanding. The ritual notes described previous ceremonies with clinical precision, documenting the deaths of at least 7 women over the past 2 decades. Each victim had been selected for specific qualities: youth, intelligence, and most importantly, bloodlines untainted by the genetic corruption that marked the established swamp families. Their deaths had coincided with periods of prosperity for the LaRue clan, as if their sacrifice had purchased divine favor or protection from the hostile forces that plagued other bayou dwellers. The most disturbing revelations concerned the nature of the entities that the LaRue family served through their ritualistic murders. Ma Tildy's writings described creatures that inhabited the deepest parts of the swamp, beings that possessed intelligence and malevolence far beyond anything found in normal wildlife. These entities demanded regular tribute in the form of human sacrifice, and failure to provide such offerings would result in the total destruction of the family that had entered into covenant with them. Ma Tildy's writings revealed her belief that Alara represented the perfect sacrifice, a woman whose education and refinement would make her blood particularly pleasing to the entities who demanded regular offerings. The old woman had spent weeks preparing special herbs and conducting purification rituals designed to enhance the spiritual potency of the planned murder. The wedding ceremony served merely as window dressing for what was essentially a human sacrifice disguised as religious observance. The ritual dagger found among the ashes bore traces of previous ceremonies, its blade stained with the blood of women whose names had been carefully recorded in Ma Tildy's ledger. Each entry contained detailed notes about the victim's background, the circumstances of her capture, and the specific benefits that her death had supposedly brought to the family. The most recent entry, dated October 29th, described Alara as the final offering that will secure our covenant for generations to come. But Alara had overheard enough whispered conversations to understand her true fate long before the ceremony began. Her apparent submission had been a careful performance, designed to lull her captors into complacency while she prepared her escape. The fire was not an act of random vengeance, but a precisely calculated response to the discovery that her wedding night would also mark her ritual murder. The realization that she faced imminent death rather than forced marriage had transformed Alara from victim to predator, a caged creature who chose to destroy her captors rather than submit to their blade. Her knowledge of chemistry and her weeks of careful observation had provided both the means and the opportunity to turn their sacred ceremony into a funeral pyre that consumed the entire family along with their twisted covenant. The most chilling aspect of Ma Tildy's notes concerned the consequences of breaking the covenant through failure to provide regular sacrifices. According to the old woman's writings, the entities that protected the LaRue family would turn their malevolence against them if the blood offerings ceased, bringing destruction that would make their previous acts of violence seem merciful by comparison. Alara's escape had not just denied them a single victim, it had potentially doomed the entire family to a fate worse than death. The captive bride didn't burn down a home, she disrupted an altar. The official inquest into the LaRue compound fire convened on November 8, 1883, in the cramped courthouse of Port Sanguine, with Judge Anatole Boudreau presiding. The judge, no relation to the vanished trapper despite sharing his surname, possessed the kind of political acumen that understood when truth served justice and when it merely caused inconvenient complications for the established order. Dr. Leroy presented his findings with scientific precision, detailing the evidence of accelerants, the ritualistic arrangement of the bodies, and the discovery of Ma Tildy's sacrifice records. His testimony painted a picture of systematic murder disguised as religious ceremony, with clear implications that the fire had been set by an intended victim who chose resistance over submission to ritual death. The coroner's evidence should have prompted a massive investigation into decades of missing persons and official corruption. The physical evidence from the fire scene supported Dr. Leroy's conclusions about the deliberate nature of the conflagration. The pattern of burn damage indicated multiple ignition points, all connected by trails of accelerant that could not have occurred naturally. The positioning of the bodies suggested that the victims had been trapped deliberately, their exits blocked by debris that showed signs of intentional placement. The discovery of ritual implements and sacrificial altars provided additional proof of the family's criminal activities, but the inquest faced pressure from sources that extended far beyond the local community's desire to avoid scandal. State officials with connections to the timber industry expressed concern that sensational reports about ritualistic murder might damage Louisiana's reputation and discourage investment in the region's natural resources. The Catholic Church worried that detailed coverage of the LaRue family's pagan practices might undermine faith among rural parishioners who already struggled with superstition and folk beliefs. Instead, the inquest concluded that the fire had been caused by an overturned lantern during a family gathering, the kind of tragic accident that claimed lives throughout rural Louisiana when isolation and poverty led to dangerous living conditions. The deaths were ruled accidental. The missing persons cases remained closed, and any evidence that contradicted this narrative was deemed inadmissible due to its inflammatory and speculative nature. Sheriff Crocker submitted his resignation, effective immediately after the inquest, citing health concerns and a desire to return to family in Texas. His departure was accepted without question, and no effort was made to investigate the suspicious payments detailed in his personal ledger. The town council appointed a temporary replacement who understood that certain areas of Vermilion Parish were best left to govern themselves according to their own ancient customs. The new sheriff, a man named Etienne Boudreau, who claimed distant relation to the missing trapper, made it clear that his jurisdiction ended at the edge of the bayou and that any problems arising from the deep swamp would be handled by whatever forces had traditionally maintained order in those regions. His approach to law enforcement focused on maintaining peace within the civilized portions of the parish, while avoiding confrontation with the supernatural elements that allegedly controlled the wetlands. The LaRue property was deemed cursed by popular consensus and abandoned to the encroaching swamp. Within months, the bayou began reclaiming the island where the compound had stood, cypress roots breaking through the foundation. Stones, while Spanish moss draped the blackened timbers like funeral shrouds. Hunters and trappers reported strange sounds emanating from the ruins, voices that spoke in the distinctive LaRue patois, despite the fact that no living family members remained to produce such sounds. Alara Dubois vanished as completely as if the bayou had swallowed her whole. Her personal belongings, including the botanical sketches that had brought her to Port Sanguine, were discovered in her rented room and quietly disposed of by her landlady. The missing persons notice that appeared in the New Orleans Picayune described her as a troubled young woman who had wandered into the swamp and was presumed drowned, just another victim of the treacherous waterways that claimed so many unwary travelers. The timber smuggling operation ended with the LaRue family's destruction, but the profits it had generated ensured that no one in Port Sanguine possessed any incentive to investigate its methods or sources. The mayor's brother-in-law quietly dissolved his paper company and invested his accumulated wealth in legitimate businesses that asked no uncomfortable questions about the origin of their initial capital. The network of corruption that had enabled the LaRue family's crimes simply adapted to new opportunities rather than facing justice. The town wanted the story to end in the ashes, but legends, like swamp plants, have deep roots. More than a century has passed since the fire that consumed the LaRue compound, but Cypress Knee Bayou continues to attract those who seek truth in the darkness where official history fears to look. Urban explorers and paranormal investigators make pilgrimages to the coordinates where Devil's Island once rose above the black water, though the exact location remains a matter of debate among those who claim knowledge of such things. Modern satellite imagery shows only unbroken swamp where the LaRue compound stood, the bayou having reclaimed the land so completely that no trace remains of human habitation. But locals continue to report strange phenomena in the area. Lights that move through the darkness without source, voices that speak in archaic French patois, and the persistent smell of burning wood where no fires have been lit for generations. Dr. Sarah Chen, a historian at Tulane University who has studied isolated communities throughout the Gulf Coast region, believes that the LaRue family represented a broader pattern of social pathology that developed in areas where geographic isolation combined with economic desperation to create conditions favorable to extreme behavior. Her research suggests that similar clans may have operated throughout the remote wetlands of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The most intriguing modern evidence comes from genealogical researchers who have traced the bloodlines of several missing persons cases to families that lived near isolated swamp communities. DNA analysis of remains discovered during recent construction projects has revealed patterns of inbreeding consistent with the kind of genetic bottlenecking that would result from generations of isolation and intermarriage. These findings suggest that the LaRue family's practices may have been less unique than previously assumed. Chen's research into historical records has uncovered evidence of at least 12 other cases involving isolated families who practiced forms of ritualistic violence similar to what the LaRue clan inflicted on their victims. These families operated in different states and time periods, but they shared common characteristics: extreme isolation, genetic deterioration from inbreeding, and belief systems that incorporated human sacrifice as a means of supernatural protection or empowerment. Photography enthusiasts and ghost hunters regularly post images to social media, claiming to show the pale woman of Cypress Knee Bayou, a figure in white that allegedly appears at the water's edge during the hours before dawn. Analysis of these photographs typically reveals reflection patterns and light artifacts that can be explained by natural phenomena, but the persistent nature of such sightings suggests that something in the collective consciousness continues to associate the area with feminine presence and tragic loss. The most disturbing modern parallel emerged in 2019, when authorities in Lafourche Parish discovered a compound where members of an extended family had been living in complete isolation while engaging in practices that bore uncomfortable similarities to the LaRue clan's recorded activities. The investigation revealed evidence of inbreeding, ritualistic behavior, and the disappearance of several individuals who had been adopted into the family under suspicious circumstances. That case resulted in 17 arrests and the rescue of 12 victims, including children who had been born into captivity and had never experienced life outside the compound. The similarities to the historical LaRue case prompted renewed interest in the 1883 incident and raised disturbing questions about how many similar operations might currently exist in the remote areas of the Gulf Coast region. Modern law enforcement agencies have begun sharing information about isolated communities that exhibit patterns associated with ritualistic violence and human trafficking. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit has developed profiles based partially on historical cases like the LaRue family, helping investigators identify warning signs that might indicate the presence of similar criminal operations in contemporary settings. The fire silenced the LaRues, but it gave birth to a story that refuses to die. The legend of the captive bride who burned her captors alive has endured for more than a century because it speaks to fundamental truths about power, survival, and the lengths to which desperate people will go to preserve their freedom. Whether Alara Dubois was a victim who became a killer or a killer who chose her victims carefully, her story resonates with anyone who has ever felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The bayou keeps its secrets with the same jealous care that it guards its treasures, and Alara took hers with her into whatever fate awaited beyond the burning chapel. We cannot know whether she survived her escape into the swamp, whether she found her way to safety in some distant city, or whether the black water that saved her from the fire eventually claimed her life as it had claimed so many others who entered its embrace. What we can say with certainty is that on October 30th, 1883, the balance of power in Cypress Knee Bayou shifted forever. The LaRue family's reign of terror ended not through the intervention of law enforcement or the justice system, but through the direct action of a woman who refused to accept her assigned role as victim. The fire that consumed their compound lit up the night sky like a signal, announcing that even the deepest darkness could not hide from the light of righteous fury. The ash that settled over the bayou in the days following the fire carried with it the molecular remains of a family that had believed themselves beyond the reach of consequence. That ash became part of the ecosystem, feeding the plants and animals that would reclaim their territory, transforming their physical substance into new life that bore no memory of their crimes or their corrupted bloodline. The story raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and the circumstances under which violence becomes not just acceptable, but necessary. Alara faced a choice between submission to ritual murder and resistance that would inevitably result in the deaths of her captors. Her decision to choose violence represents a fundamental assertion of human dignity in the face of absolute evil, a refusal to accept victimization as her destiny. But perhaps the most important truth revealed by this story lies not in its historical details, but in its enduring power to disturb and fascinate. The captive bride represents every person who has ever been told to submit, to accept, to endure what cannot be endured. Her choice to burn rather than break serves as both inspiration and warning. Sometimes the only justice that can reach the deepest, darkest places is the justice you bring with you and carry out yourself. The parallels between the historical LaRue case and modern instances of ritual abuse and human trafficking demonstrate that the fundamental dynamics of predator and prey have not changed significantly in the intervening century. Isolated communities still harbor individuals who believe that their power over others grants them immunity from consequences, and vulnerable people still face situations where official channels of justice remain closed to them. In a world where monsters learn to wear the masks of respectability and authority, remember that fire purifies everything it touches, leaving only truth in its wake. The bayou still whispers Alara's name when the wind moves through the cypress trees, reminding us that some debts can only be paid in flames, and some prisons can only be escaped by burning them down. The anonymous letter that appeared in the New Orleans Picayune 1 month after the fire contained a single line that has echoed through the decades. They sought a purifying fire. I provided it. Let the swamp take the rest. Whether those words came from Alara herself or from someone who understood her story, they capture the essential truth of what happened in Cypress Knee Bayou on that October night. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who refused to be victims, who chose to fight back against impossible odds, and who proved that even the most powerless can become the instruments of justice when the system fails them. The past is full of such stories, and the present continues to create new ones every day. Sometimes the only way to escape hell is to burn it down behind you.